Welcome. In reading Dr. Gillespie's paper in anticipation of her talk today, I was struck by the questions she asks. For example, if love propels one up the scale of natura, the ladder of being, then why doesn't Eve's love for Adam enable her to ascend? Or, how does Eve's rationality differ from Adam's reason? And I was equally, it's in the paper. I'm pulling it right out of the paper. And I was equally struck though by the conclusions. Here's a couple. Apparently, the very quality which renders Eve in need of government, let's sink in, automatically renders Adam incapable of governing her. Full stop, period. You ready? Hierarchy fails. My big thing. Then this is a little more difficult to follow when you're not actually reading the paper, but I want it to come out of my mouth. Or, Nyqvist is right that Milton tries to deny Eve the makings of selfhood, but wrong that he succeeds. If anything, the anti-adulterous terms upon which free humans are differentiated from enslaved beasts endows Eve with a self that undermines Milton's labored attempts at enforcing inequality. Came out of my mouth. Dr. Gillespie is professor of the 17th century English and colonial American literature at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. She is the author of Domesticity and Dissent in the 17th Century, English Women Writers in the Public Sphere, interested in the public and private sphere, and Women Writing in the English Republic, 1625 to 1681. She is currently working on her next book, Eve's Economy, Capitalism and Female Agency in the English Restoration. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gillespie to Chapman University for her talk, Shades of Representation, Lucy Hutchinson's Ghost, and the Politics of the Representative. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Jen, for that amazing introduction. You could read the whole paper, do it so dramatically. I have many people to thank for being here, Bart and Dan, running the Smith Institute, all the members of the Smith Institute I've read, Jonah Levin of the English Department and the members of the English Department. Thank you all. I want to say a special thanks to the students of Chapman. I've been able to visit 4 classes while I was here, and they've so inspired me. They remind me why I'm here. So I'll dedicate this to your students and mine. My scholarship, as Jen said, is dedicated to revising the literary canon to assimilate lesser known and or newly discovered works by women writers. Whereas Virginia Woolf famously lamented the seeming impossibility of a Judith Shakespeare, that is a woman who would have enjoyed the same access to literary success as did the legendary William, feminist canon revision efforts continue to recover surprising numbers of women writers who, in spite of various very real prohibitions against female expression, were able to put down the needles, ladies, and pick up the pen. The realization of how great the gap is between official prohibitions against women's writing on the one hand and women's actual writing practices on the other has necessitated the reevaluation of patriarchy as a system that was as successful in its bid for totality as its apologists represented it as being. Indeed, my work is specifically dedicated to recovering the voices of women whose writings actively critiqued patriarchy, as it was enacted through the monarchical system of patriarchalism before, during, and beyond the English Civil War period of the 17th century. But also, my work is informed by the degree to which in the process of recovering these oppositional texts, I have found that they frequently contravene not only the royalist imperatives of their day, but also the largely negative view that many modern feminists hold of the allegedly masculinist modes of political liberalism which emerged to confront and replace those imperatives. In this talk, I will discuss some of my newest work in this area, and that is the contribution that literary works by a 17th century woman writer named Lucy Hutchinson made to the so-called good old cause of English republicanism just after Oliver Cromwell died in 1658 and Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660. I will highlight the specific and innovative nature of Hutchinson's contribution to liberal thought by heeding the call first issued by Mary Nyqvist and Margaret Ferguson in 1987 in Remembering Milton, their groundbreaking essay collection on gender and the writings of John Milton. That call is, as they say, to situate Milton's presentation of gender relations in relation to the various women writers of the period who have recently been discovered. However, unlike a number of other critics who have likewise heeded and continue to heed this call, I will not conclude that doing so necessarily advances Nyqvist and Ferguson's stated goal of furthering the third wave feminist attack on Western bourgeois liberalism, the increasingly maligned philosophical tradition which Milton is said to presage through his problematic separation of various private spheres, including the domestic sphere of the home, from the public political sphere of the state. As Nyqvist argues, while it may appear that Milton's Paradise Lost gives us a theory of gender equality by providing Eve with a dominion over the world via the ordering and naming of plants that is symmetrical to Adam's dominion over the world via his naming of animals, it is in fact the case that this technique of formal balance and harmonious pairing merely neutralizes differences that are ordered hierarchically and ideologically because they depend upon liberalism's progressive privatization and sentimentalization of the domestic sphere. This separation of spheres is said to in turn entail a novel and highly circumscribed notion of female subjectivity, which is exemplified in Milton's epic by the fact that Adam's narcissistic desire for Eve to function as his other self is rewarded, while Eve's preference for her own image is unambiguously constituted as a specular illusion and an error. Neoplatonists read this narcissist myth as a tragic reflection of the fall of spirit into matter. But Milton turns this into a comedy by successfully enlightening Eve to the superiority of Adam's manly grace and wisdom over her feminine beauty and consignment to motherhood. Adam's manly grace and wisdom are not represented as mere attributes of him, but as the reality principle itself for a liberal order. Thus, the idea that Eve ever possessed a self that enabled her to share dominion with Adam is delusional. In her study Engendering the Fall, Shannon Miller extends this critique to the high liberal political philosopher John Locke, asserting that Locke reiterates Milton by subsuming women into the private biblical subjectivity of Eve's motherhood while using Adam to craft a universal conception of man whose acquisition of dominion over the world through labor enables him to begin the very development of state organization and to in turn rule over that state. Miller then follows Nyqvist in arguing that a number of 17th century texts by English women offer alternative interpretations of the fall, in which men and women are constituted as equally serviceable unto God in their cultivation of his garden, and thus enjoy joint acquisition of dominion over his creation, thereby subverting the liberal separation of private from the public. By returning to these women's texts, we recover a counter-tradition of thought in which women's equal access with men to state power comprises the fullest measure of gender equality and, by extension, a just society. In my discussion of Lucy Hutchinson, I will agree with Nyqvist and Miller that placing the voice of an early modern woman writer into dialogue with the liberal tradition, as it is represented in this context by Milton, reveals the multiple ways in which early modern women writers articulated the relationship between gender equality and government. However, for my part, I will argue that in a cycle of elegies and a set of memoirs that, that Hutchinson wrote for her husband, John Hutchinson, who was the governor of Lunnington Castle, a colonel in Parliament's New Model Army during the Civil Wars, and a member of Parliament under Cromwell, who was accused of conspiring against Charles II in 1663 and died in a royal prison shortly thereafter. Hutchinson redirects our attention to women's interest in the dimensions of liberal thought, which understood dominion as something to be limited rather than gained. While, as stated, many modern critics define female equality as synonymous with women's equal access to political power, Hutchinson joined a number of male counterparts, including Milton, in arguing that the cultivation of virtue within the private sphere by both men and women would structure a highly limited sphere of rule and a diminished, even spectral role for rulers. Unlike her male counterparts, including Milton, Hutchinson explicitly draws upon the biblical subjectivity of Eve to craft a version of this vision in which female selfhood comprises the liberal reality principle for all. Both men and women are equally capable of projecting their narcissistic preference for themselves and or their own objects of desire onto others, and using it to rationalize their assumption and exercise of institutional power. But this equal capacity for error also means that both men and women are equally capable of redeeming this tragic fall of spirit into matter via the exercise of reason and its paradoxically wise illumination of human fallibility, thereby constituting the reality principle of a liberal order as consent and self-rule for both men and women, as well as a mode of representative government in which representatives were structurally prevented from institutionally enacting their desire for dominion over others. Okay, so Lucy Hutchinson was born in 1620, the daughter of Sir Alan Apsley, Lieutenant of the Tower of London, and Lady Lucy St. John, for whom she's named. Lucy married her own husband, John, in 1638. Together they had 9 children. She's becoming incredibly well known for her poem, Order and Disorder, a 20-canto long biblical epic that she wrote right around the same time in the 1670s that Milton wrote Paradise Lost. But very little is known about her early life other than her literary output and the scant bit of information we receive about her education in classical Latin from the very brief sketch of her own life that she began to write before switching to what she regarded as a more interesting subject matter, and that was the life of her husband. These memoirs of her husband, as well as the elegies she penned after his death, are, like her epic, worthy of further note. For in them, Hutchinson experimented with literary modes of representation that placed her in a long line of Renaissance writers who began to articulate the liberal reality principle of limited dominion through dramatizing the improper modes of looking and being looked at that were associated with tyrants. In this line of thought, tyrants, such as the last Roman king Tarquin, were typically represented as bestial, theatrical, uxorious, covetous, and idolatrous. As Tarquin infamously did with Lucretia, tyrants became tyrants when they succumbed to their base desires to idolatrously compel their subjects' gaze by surrounding themselves with the patina of divinity, all the while viewing their subject as mere objects and extensions of themselves, rather than as autonomous beings in possession of their own personal sovereignty. Tyrants' enslavement into these passions signified their loss of reason and ineligibility for power. This Renaissance conceit persisted into the 17th century, utilized by English Republicans, including Hutchinson and Milton, to discredit Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, and Charles II, respectively, for their idolatrous use of royal iconography, including that of the royal image of the king himself, as not just a representative of God, but his emanation. Because real icons were designed to enthrall subjects by dazzling their senses, rather than freeing them by activating their reason through persuasion, Republicans sought to replace them with a limited and demystified state. In this state, the ghost or shade would constitute the proper subject position for representatives, given that it was now their responsibility to reflect the will of the people rather than to impose their own upon them. As the anonymous author of England's Misery and Remedy wrote in 1645, representatives needed to understand that they were not sun kings, whose obsession with staging their own divinity led them to obscure the sovereignty of their people. Rather, they were public servants, and hence needed to imagine themselves as shadows who were obliged to magnify the people's substance rather than their own. Given that in a republic, the people were the rulers, every individual was representative in that he or she too had to be made conscious of the ways in which they represented themselves to others and how they viewed others in turn. Specifically, they had to be made aware of the destructive effects that occurred when individuals hubristically assumed and or fallaciously invested others with godlike powers. As George Wither wrote in his poem, Vox Pacifica in 1645, but let them know that when people are elected as representatives, 'twas for another thing, which they but represent, and where ere long them to a strict account will doubtless bring, of any way they do it wilful wrong. For that indeed is really the face, whereof they are the shadow and the glass. But along with teaching representatives to function as shadows of the people's right to self-determination, rather than as shining refractors of their own glory, institutions also had to be developed that would permanently consign representatives to the shadows. In his poem, The Dark Lantern, 1652, Wither envisioned a House of Representatives motored by the permanent revolution of election cycles and term limits, and a Supreme Senate whose 12 members inhabited a purgatorial space wherein they would do little else but safeguard the citizens' rights by performing a penitential awareness of their own penchant for tyrannically envying and expropriating those rights. As Wither argues, by this means every man within his board shall be restrained, and none have power to aspire by his ambition to a station higher. After English Republicans failed to erect such institutions, they blamed themselves for their own inability to turn away from the idols of ambition. Instead of retreating after Charles II was restored, as they are often said to have done, they shifted their efforts towards reforming individuals, specifically the flawed modes of looking and representation that undergirded tyranny. Those efforts accelerated what historian of political ideas Clement Fatovich identifies as a crucial stage in the development in England of both liberal and socialistic variations on Republican thought. That is the transposition of Protestant Europe's external struggle against the Counter-Reformation and England's internal struggle against royal and clerical tyranny onto the individual's own interior civil war, or psychomachia, with the inner tyrant. Milton is already recognized as having contributed significantly to this transposition, broadening the definition of idolatry, from the practice of superstitious rites to a psychological condition of social, religious, and political enthrallment. For him, monarchy was a civil kind of idolatry, in that it used such motifs as the halo to deify the king and enslave the people to their passions. In the ready and easy way to establish a commonwealth, written all too belatedly in 1660, Milton, like George Wither, envisioned the antidote to be a Senate with minimal control over citizens' lives. But given that Milton offered this vision only as the Restoration loomed, he spent more time arguing that a free republic was best attained and maintained through education rather than military or political fiat. As he writes, to make the people fittest to choose and the chosen fittest to govern will be to teach the people virtue, temperance, modesty, sobriety, parsimony, and justice. Such individuals would prove the fittest to vote and to rule precisely because they would be uncomfortable with wielding institutional power. But given that possessing power in and of itself corrupts, a limited government was needed to ensure that even the most august among those elected would not succumb to temptation once in office. The spectral selfhood of submission rather than the manly labor of dominion formed the reality principle for proper rule. Milton's treatment of psychic idolatry stumbles, however, when it comes to applying the prohibitions against worshiping humans as gods to women, and hence by implication to envisioning the role that women could play in the formation and perpetuation of the Republic. Milton's belief that the only objects worthy of reverence on earth are ordinary human beings, as bearers of God's image, would seem to constitute men and women as equals, as would Milton's own non-gendered use of we and us in pamphlets such as Civil Power to refer to those whose God within entitles them to exercise their own conscience. Indeed, when Satan first sees Adam and Eve in Eden in Paradise Lost, he is impressed by what he sees as Adam and Eve's equal standing. Two of far nobler shape, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honor clad, in naked majesties he lords of all, and worthy seemed, for in their looks divine, the image of their glorious Maker shone. However, the narrator informs us that while Adam and Eve are in true filial freedom placed, they are not equal to one another as their sex not equal seemed. Because Eve's wanton ringlets resemble the tendrils of the vine, she is consigned to coy submission, while Adam's large front and eyes sublime declared absolute rule. As Milton famously aphorizes, he for God only, she for God in him. Milton does not wonder if his physiological essentialism consigns Eve to idolatry. Thus he provokes, but does not address, much less answer the question of how Eve is to love and obey Adam as God without idolizing him. When Raphael visits Eden to warn the pair of Satan's proximity, he speaks to the difference between love versus idolization. But Eve by this time has gone off to tend her plants, and thus is not privy to the lesson. Adam seizes upon his time alone with the angel to confess that the quite chaste delight his senses take in the earth's beauty differs from the charged passion he feels when he gazes at Eve and experiences the charm of beauty's powerful glance. Raphael chides Adam for sliding him to subjection to an outside. True love, he instructs, hath his seat in reason, and because it refines the thoughts and heart enlarges, it is the scale or ladder by which humans ascend to heavenly love. Carnal pleasure, on the other hand, reduces one to bestial sensuality and evacuates reason. To ascend to reason, Adam must respect what is higher in Eve's society, that is her humanity and rationality. Feeling half abashed, Adam insists that nothing so much delights him as those graceful acts, those 1,000 decencies that daily flow from all her words and actions, mixed with love and sweet compliance, which declare unfeigned union of mind, or in us both one soul. But these declarations raise more questions than they answer. If love propels one up the scala natural, then why doesn't Eve's love for Adam enable her to ascend? How does Eve's rationality differ from Adam's reason? If she is capable of graceful acts, and her words and actions give rise to 1,000 decencies that declare union of mind and soul with Adam, and if these markers of interior worth matter more than externalities, then what warrants Eve's sweet compliance? Adam's use of such phrases as the charm of beauty's powerful glance echoes the Republican critique of the monarchical trappings that were said to enthrall unwitting subjects. But again, if for Milton, the evil of idolatry resides less in the external gesture than in the internal servility involved in worshiping anything that is not God, then Adam's rapture is a comment upon his own propensity to idolize rather than any pretension on Eve's part to divinity. Apparently, the very quality, beauty, which renders Eve in need of government automatically renders Adam incapable of governing her. God's prescribed hierarchy fails, as does Raphael's lecture in the garden, given that after the fall, Jesus the Son rejects Adam's explanation for the transgression. She gave me of the tree, and I didn't eat, and instead blames Adam's own idolatrous love for his wife. Was she thy God, that her thou didst obey? Beware his voice. Or was she made thy guide, superior or by equal, that to her thou didst resign thy manhood, and the place wherein God set thee above her made of thee? But if Eve is innocent, and her beauty rather than her substance attracted Eve even after he had been given instruction by Raphael, then why is Adam still superior after the fall? A mere rhetorical deus ex machina supplies the answer. Adam reigns because his perfections surpass Eve's in all real dignity. But what is real dignity? We are not told. Adam rules, it would seem, because God says so. Mary Nyqvist is right that Milton tries to deny Eve the makings of selfhood, but wrong that he succeeds. For as we see even more clearly as the epic nears its end, the model of selfhood idealized by Raphael raises the possibility that it is Eve's biblical subjectivity which forms an unacknowledged universal in Milton's work, and which in turn will form the basis for an entire social order predicated not upon shared, but rather limited dignity for all. We hear how this idealized model of female biblical subjectivity and this social order will co-emerge when the angel Michael arrives to execute God's injunction to banish Adam and Eve from paradise. Before doing so, he allows a traumatized Eve to sleep in her bower, while warning Adam that the world they will now inhabit will be ruled by grievous wolves, and their satanic assaults will turn all the sacred mysteries of heaven to their own vile advantage of lucre and ambition. However, the resulting flagrant mass will not be eradicated through competing forms of warfare or political power. Instead, it will be purged and refined by the return of him so lately promised to thy aid, the woman's seed. By filling the faithful with a spirit of love and providing them with spiritual armor able to resist, the Son, who at that stage will have sacrificed himself to become Christ, will enable humans, all humans, to ascend the Scala Natura and found new heavens, new earth. Adam finally draws the proper conclusion. The accomplishment of great things will be done by things deemed weak. The worldly strong and worldly wise will be subverted by the simply weak. And to obey is best, and love with fear the only God. The masculine is reduced to resisting epic calls to arms and spurning the trappings of political power, while the sacrificial feminine is elevated to the agent of refinement. Drawing attention to the reversal without explicitly acknowledging it, Michael tells Adam that when Eve awakens, he should chiefly pass on to her this message of the proto-evangelium, the first gospel. That is the aforementioned promise of the triumph of the woman's seed, which God delivers in even fuller form to Satan after the fall. As God tells Satan, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, thou shalt bruise his heel. However, upon waking, Eve reports that God has already told her of her destiny in her dreams. By me, she intones, the promised seed shall all restore. Adam, the designated mediator, has been bypassed by direct communication between Eve and the divine. What is more, when one considers that Eve's articulation of the proto-evangelium comprises both her final words and the last words of the epic to be uttered by anyone other than the narrator, one can infer that Milton's placement of this creed as the last and thus possible best message of the epic elevates Eve, the meek, mild, and obedient, to the status of not just a mother, but a representative subject whose humiliating fall into sin and subsequent acceptance of submission to God alone comprises the foundation for a just society. Men and women share an unacknowledged equality, not because they both seek or possess dominion, but because they are equally destined to obey God's injunction to reject the pretensions of those who claim to have it. And yet, as noted, Milton doesn't explicitly address, much less resolve, the contradiction between his critique of idolaters and his promulgation of gender hierarchy, neither throughout his work in general, nor by the end of Paradise Lost. While previewing the future, Raphael shows Adam the society of the Canaanites, drawing particular attention to those male offspring of Cain who have yielded up all their virtue to the smiles of pretty Canaanite women. To the angel's frustration, Adam is still inclined to admit delight at the sight of this ostensibly amenable society. Raphael reacts swiftly, first conceding that yes, the Canaanites do now swim in joy, but then warning that ere long, God will send the flood that will drive them to swim at large, as the world, a world of tears must weep. Adam has yet again been taken in by appearances, and so it is still problematic that even though Eve is humble by nature and worthy of direct composition by God, she must still look to Adam as the exemplar of soul obedience to God. An especially worrisome proposition now, given that even as Adam is being escorted out of Eden for his uxoriousness, he spares a smile of his own for the chimera that Raphael had conjured of the pretty Canaanite women. Given that for Milton, the human propensity to mistake appearances for substance renders everyone unfit to rule over others, one can conclude that husbandly intercession is as problematic as its political correlatives. And yet Milton avoids stating this explicitly, leaving us instead with an unresolved conundrum. In what follows, I argue that Lucy Hutchinson resolves this conundrum by demonstrating that as a woman, she has the same capacity as men do for degenerating into idolatry and ascending into love, and hence the same capacity for constructing and representing the Republic by helping people to distinguish appearance from substance. By using a literary version of shadows to illuminate her own dark capacity for error, as well as her ability to acquire new wisdom, she privileges the guilty knowledge that Eve gains in hindsight as the reality principle that undergirds the higher ways of looking needed to prevent undue claims of hierarchy. She transmits this knowledge through seeking reform modes of representing her love for her husband in the wake of his untimely death. Excuse me. When Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, his act of free and general pardon, indemnity, and oblivion granted clemency to the parliamentarians who had defeated the crown after a decade of civil war and implemented or tried to implement a republic in its stead. The act also consigned the Civil War and Commonwealth eras to oblivion by purging them from the historical record. The exception were the signatories to the order for Charles I's beheading. These murderers of my father, as Charles described them, would be condemned to that most literal form of oblivion, death. In the end, only a handful of commissioners were executed, but royalists still infamed their impotence in history as Christ-killing traitors and satanic rebels who had to be prevented from further simulating themselves as heroic saints and leading their deluded followers into further prosecution of their oh so glorious cause. Lucy Hutchinson's John was labeled just such a traitor. Along with serving as the governor of Nottingham, a colonel in the New Model Army, and a member of Parliament, John Hutchinson was a member of the court that condemned Charles I to death in 1649. He later withdrew from government service in protest of Oliver Cromwell's increasing ambition. After Cromwell died in 1658, John Hutchinson joined the Convention Parliament to try and salvage the Commonwealth. But he was thwarted by the Restoration and, as a regicide, denied clemency. Supporters worked to obtain his pardon, but he prepared for death. His wife actually forged a letter of apology in his name and gained his pardon. But he was still barred from holding office, and in 1663 accused of conspiracy. No formal charges were filed, but he died in prison the following year. Riven with sorrow, his widow composed her cycle of elegies dedicated to her spouse and her biography of his life. In these elegies and memoirs, she recovers her husband from oblivion by dismantling his image as a simulated saint condemned to hell and replacing it with that of the virtuous Republican man whose dedication to the cause earned him a true saint's rest in heaven. But to do so, she has to at least temporarily idolize him. And in the process, she is nonetheless still able to provide what Milton avoids, the spectacle of a woman who has failed to subdue her idolatrous passions and is left a specter by the loss of her idol. As she laments in Elegy 1, her husband's death means that she is now her own pale, empty shade. And as she writes in the memoirs, while her spouse has gone hence, she remains an airy phantasm walking about his sepulchre. But by representing herself as a specter, Hutchinson does not betray a lack of selfhood, but dramatizes and exploits the potential for refinement in the plight of the female idolater, thereby constituting the equality of simultaneously flawed and transcendently reflective subjectivity as the foundation for a republic defined by a limited political sphere in which elected representatives represent the people rather than themselves, and a private sphere of civil society in which the people emulate God by cultivating virtue. In other words, he for God only, she for God only. In her elegies, Hutchinson explicitly uses Eve to link self-formation to Republican reformation by her capacity to recognize her own human propensity to err. Her husband's death should result in submission to God's will, but instead, her grief causes her to look back rather than up. As she writes in the elegy, these verses transcribed out of my other book, J.H. If I cast my sorrow-drowned eyes, I see out our near to be re-entered paradise, the flaming sword which doth us thence exclude, by sad remorse and ugly guilt pursued. But if on my sin-defiled self I gaze, my nakedness and spots do me amaze. Exiled from the paradise of her marriage and republic, she is now, as she puts it, her own pale shade. Because, as she states in Elegy 1, the effect of her human passion for her husband was inevitably woe and death. Her husband achieved love divine by bringing his wild passions under servitude and dedicating himself to God. As a result, he is now death's spotless victim. She, however, is covered with spots because her lusts enslaved in sadder thraldom lie. And while his steadfast look is fixed on God alone, her gaze continues to roam, even lingering in the elegy called the Night Ape, to idolatrously catalog the features of her husband's face. While she recognizes her error, her knowledge is gained in hindsight after her transgression lands her in a purgatory of regret and reflection. Although tormented, this space enables her to validate the idea that she did have a true self, one composed of womanly grace and wisdom, that was condemned to death in life, not because she failed to worship her husband as God, but because she succeeded. This psychic purgatory supplies the battleground, which allows Hutchinson to dramatize her own war with her own inner tyrant, and to display her new ability to see into the sublime workings of sight. Hutchinson first notes that readers might express mirth at the fact that she, the Puritan, has invoked the Catholic fable of purgatory. But by imagining herself as hovering within this fabled place, she draws upon the Protestant transposition of the geography of purgatory onto the mental landscape of the fallen human condition. In this post-Obserian threshold between heaven and hell, one attains higher understanding by recognizing that while earth can be made to simulate God's kingdom, it is not heaven itself. The few who never confuse the two possess perfect and clean hearts. Those who mistake one for the other harbor hearts that burn like ovens, hearts fueled by lust, envy, and ambition, Judas hearts. The hearts in the middle are the melting, broken, and contrite hearts, owned by those awakened to their proclivity for blankness. That awakening enables them to detect the charnel house that lurks beneath heavenly simulacra, and to enlighten others to the dark truth that, as John Donne wrote, we are all our own ghosts. This spectral condition is constituted by Hutchinson as representative, in that it models the subject position that her readers, including prospective elected representatives, are to adopt so that they can constantly see and reflect upon the tyrannical consequences of mistaking representation for that which is represented. The insight provided by and within this self-mediating state also allows Hutchinson to expose the fate that awaits idolatrous royalists in the Restoration. Charles II's propagandists quickly reconstituted the solar iconography of the monarchy, arguing that the beauty of a king is the brightest thing that a nation's eye can be fixed upon. While John Hutchinson had fixed his eyes upon God, Lucy, like the royalists, was still charmed by that mighty witch who disguises the loathsome dunghill of the world as groves and palaces. But from her vantage point, she can transmit the knowledge that her husband now occupies one of the blessed seats in heaven, while those royalists who still fail to make carnal reason freely to lay down at the Lord's feet her scepter and her crown will be condemned to blindness and subjection. In the introduction to the memoirs of the life of Colonel John Hutchinson, she identifies her children as the intended beneficiaries of the hard-earned lessons and delineates how these lessons apply to both the personal and the political spheres. She preserves the distinction between family and state in order to argue that the private sphere functions as the arbiter of the education needed to sustain the republic. But as a mother, her pedagogical labor constructs the republic through the propagation of this virtue rather than through military adventurism or political contestation. She is still in mourning, so her task is difficult, but she makes that interior struggle the basis for her instruction. As she writes, those who dote on mortal excellencies are endangered of letting loose the winds of passion when their adored idols are taken from them. As one who doted on her own husband's mortal excellence, she is under a command not to grieve at the common rate of desolate women. Thus she is studying how to moderate her woe while also augmenting her love. On the one hand, it is common for mourners to alleviate their grief by having reminders of the lost one removed from view. But this tactic succeeds at a cost. As oblivion's curtain is drawn over the dead face, things less lovely are light, because they are not viewed together with that which was most excellent. Deprived by oblivion of the opportunity to compare and contrast, one loses sight of the standard bearers for true worth. On the other hand, if she augments her love by gilding it with the flattering commendations used by sycophantic court poets, the ornamentation of her own devotion will eclipse her husband's substantial glory. To find her medium, she composes a naked, undressed narrative, speaking the simple truth of him. To do so, she uses verbal forms of shading or chiaroscuro to bring the depths of her husband's substance into relief through contrasting the light of that which was most excellent with the darkness of things less lovely. As Hutchinson reminds her children, as well as all the children of this erring age, hers is the less lovely but necessary perspective through which her husband will literally be viewed or represented. As she writes, her husband's life generated a resplendent body of light, designed to discover the deformities of this wicked age and to instruct the erring children of this generation. But this light can only be captured through her own apprehension and an expression. Thus it must shine as under a very thick cloud, which will obscure much of its luster. This is advantageous where there is need of this medium to this world's weak eyes, which hath but few people so virtuous in it as can believe, because they find themselves so short, that any other could make so large a progress as they in the race of piety, honor, and virtue. By shading her husband's virtue through her own weak eyes, she can enable readers to see him more clearly. The assertion that bright things are best viewed through a very thick cloud draws, of course, on the biblical tradition of seeing God through a cloud. But it is also indebted to the theory of optics, developed On the Nature of Things, the scientific poem composed by Lucretius in the 1st century and translated into English by Lucy Hutchinson in the 1650s. According to Lucretius, eyes shun splendid objects because they are made blind with gazing on the sun. In the dark, eyes can better see splendid objects because their eyes first take in the near shadows of the mist. As the splendor of the object arrives, it purges those dark shadows. But while marginalized, those shadows form a necessary frame for the act of envisioning, just as it is necessary to confine elected representatives to the shadows so that the people can shine forth as the repository of God's divine intention. Hutchinson's own introduction explicates and enacts this theory in order to reform her children and all those who, like her, delight more in the mirror that reflected the Creator's excellence than in the Creator's own fountain. To represent her husband's life as the one that reflects her greater might, she must look at him rather than God, but to remind us that this representation is just that, a representation, rather than an idol. She frames him with the supposition of shame, so that we do not mistake him as the source for his own splendor. While splendid, he is still, as she says, but man, a son of Adam, an inheritor of his corrupted nature, subject to all the sins and miseries that attend it, which is necessary to be considered, that we may more magnify the riches of God's grace and admirable power. Her memoir is the medium through which this Adam is to be magnified into a blessed image of God's own glory. In the last part of Hutchinson's memoir, she correctly provides the dark shading that reveals her husband's true splendor by commemorating him through his actions rather than his appearances. To throw his virtuous acts into greater relief, she parallels them with the perfidy of his foes. Her method recalls that of Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, a connection that is strengthened by the title of this section, The Life of John Hutchinson, and by her direct citation of Plutarch as a major influence. Plutarch drew historical parallels between important personages from Greece and Rome, and moral parallels between heroes such as the noble Brutus and villains such as the ambitious Julius Caesar. For her part, Hutchinson brings her husband's Brutus-like acts of noble self-sacrificing service into greater relief by paralleling them with the Caesarian worship of wealth and power displayed by both royalists and traitorous republicans. Just as Milton's Adam is instructed to revere Eve's acts rather than reduce his love for her to mere sensual pleasure, so too does Hutchinson turn her gaze away from her husband's beauty so that she may commemorate his deeds. Not surprisingly, the acts that she valorizes are those that actively refrain from seeking dominion over others. Echoing Raphael's rehearsal of history for Adam, she begins with a critique of the tyrannical overreach that began under the dark midnight of papacy and resulted in the English civil wars. The Reformation provoked the wrath of princes and priests by confronting them with their subjects' spiritual autonomy. In their own delusions, they set themselves up in Christ's throne and ruled by their own arbitrary lust. To control extremist Protestants likewise invested the princes of the world, whether Popish or Protestant, with God's prerogatives, thereby changing the idols but leaving the idolatry in practice. Charles I began as a temperate and chaste alternative to the intemperate lust of his father, but proved a worse encroacher upon the civil and spiritual liberties of his people. After he married a French lady of great wit and beauty, to whom he became a most luxurious husband. The Queen, Henrietta Maria, lured her husband into tyranny, and the great tragedy of the wars began. In contrast, John Hutchinson had a great passion for his wife, but was not uxorious. He loved her in the Lord as his fellow creature, not his idol, and governed his household by persuasion rather than force. Nor was he jealous to possess fame or power. When offered a commission in exchange for swearing an oath to the parliamentarians at the beginning of the war, his modesty and prudence prevented him from hastily rushing into office. But when the king threatened to confiscate Nottingham's power supply, his honest neighbors applied to him for leadership because his good affections to godliness and the interests of his country were a glory that could not be concealed. As his wife editorializes, Englishmen obeyed kings who upheld the balance of powers and observed the liberties of the people, but they were invincible in defense of their freedoms against all those usurping lords that scorned to allow them to rule. While Hutchinson continues to educate her children into the dangers of overweening rule by contrasting the vices of monarchy with the virtues of republicanism, most of her parallels involve Republicans whose own abuses of power rendered John Hutchinson's fidelity more illustrious. Armed with the idea that political malfeasance should inspire greater humility, John Hutchinson confronts Lucy Hutchinson's best example, Oliver Cromwell. A decorated general in the army, the early Cromwell was as equally zealous as John Hutchinson for service, but after becoming the new Commonwealth's first head of state, his heart became ulcerated by the poison of ambition. His lusts subverted the prospering and preserving of the Republic. In contrast, Hutchinson resigned from office on the grounds that because God by nature obliged leaders to defend the people from invading tyrants, as far as they may by a lawful call and means, then Cromwell's invasion of his own people lifted the yoke that bound John Hutchinson's service. Finally, having staged this celebration of her husband's virtues, Hutchinson uses the end of her memoirs to demystify him. As she aphorizes, all virtues are mediums and have their extremes. To return to this medium, she blurs the line between virtue and vice in the context of her husband's overly eager readiness to die for his cause after the Restoration. Under examination for his role in regicide, John Hutchinson testified that if he had erred, it was the inexperience of his age and the defect of his judgment. But he should freely submit his life and fortune, should it prove to their dispose. Hearing this, his wife begins to suspect he has become ambitious of being a public sacrifice. Her suspicion is confirmed after his arrest, when, as she writes, he went as cheerfully into captivity as another would have come out of it. She was exceedingly sad, but her husband chided her for his sadness, telling her it would blemish his innocence for her to appear afflicted. This sudden concern for appearances belies his reputation as a man who acts out of conscience. Even worse, when he declares that his martyrdom would advance the cause more by hastening the vengeance of God upon his enemies, he casts himself as a demigod, capable of spurring God on to greater virtue. By inviting us to wonder if the ideal representative hasn't become enamored with his own image as a divine martyr, Hutchinson once again reminds us that despite his glory, her husband is a man, a fallen son of Adam, not a god. Both husband and wife, Adam and Eve, are implicated in the fallen forms of representation that led to the Republic's demise. Likewise, Hutchinson's reform mode of seeing offers the promise of Republican restoration, insofar as it models the perspective which elected representatives are to adopt in their relationship to the sovereign splendor of the people. Thank you. Oh, yeah. We can stay in the shadows.
Yeah.
Lots of interesting stuff, lots of questions. Just an analogy I was thinking about are you talking how does this interplay between the idea of the Republican tradition into political theory and the way the soul, the inner life of men and women is being depicted? So one of the themes, as I understand in Republican theory, is that freedom is not just sort of the ability to do anything, but it's freedom within the law. Right? Mm-hmm. So a free citizen is someone who's a citizen, meaning bound by the law of which they are themselves the author. And so usually that gets the mirror of that is the idea that a free person is the person sort of governed by their own law, namely their reason or their rational capacities. Mm-hmm. So that's often, of course, exactly a tool by which historically men and women have been distinguished, and so like, men have this rational capacity that women lack. So I'm wondering if you see this thing also in Hutchinson, where there's that. I know you talked about like, the ability to reflect upon their own feelings. Is that right? Or is there an additional part of like there's an emphasis on women or female rationality?
Does she discuss it?
Yeah, you find it in the like,
not in the Elegies or Memoirs. I'm arguing more that she's enacting it. In Order and Disorder, the 20-long canto, the biblical epic, she has a very long section actually on marriage. It's a diatribe against marriage because it does not acknowledge that women have their own heads and that they are reasonable and that they're subject to men. And it comes right after the fall, which she blames Adam for because he's incapable of governing, because he's so besotted. And so she goes into a really long disposition that's quite explicit about, why do I have to listen to the idiot? Why did any woman have to listen to her husband? And it really is a quite long complaint, a woman's complaint, specifically about how they're denied reason. So that's become well known, and so I'm trying to argue that here she's enacting it through her modes of representation where she's constantly correcting herself and saying, okay, that's wrong to look at him that way, I have to see him like that, thereby showing that she can rise from her body into a reasonable assessment of his actions. So it's more of a performance, I guess, than a treatise. Yeah.
Sort of following on what you were just saying, I'm wondering how you situate her in terms of the famous teachings of St. Paul, which were, of course, so central to all of these discussions of husband-wife, male-female relations, and I mean, very problematic. It's sort of like they're equal, but men are more equal.
Right.
And it sounds like
Yeah.
you're saying that she's actually sort of going against the Pauline teachings, but she can't go too far.
Yeah.
So I was curious throughout your whole talk as
Yeah.
to how you conceive of her in that.
Yeah, the women have lots of fun with Paul, not just Lucy Hutchinson, but there's an injunction that they can't speak in church in Paul. On the other hand, there's an injunction that when they prophesy, they have to have their heads covered. So the women are kind of like, well, which one is it, right? So they kind of say, well, I could my head's covered so I can prophesy, therefore I can speak in church. So they play around a lot with these injunctions, but of course, one of the things they're really interested in, and including Lucy Hutchinson, again, it happens more in the order and disorder, is the relationship between Christ and the church as bride and groom. And so, because Christ is the bridegroom, the way that he is to serve the church and to honor and obey and cherish, they often argue that men are to look at women as Christ with the church, just looking to be cherished. Christ would never abuse his church. Christ would not subdue his church. He would not subordinate his church. So Hutchinson does this in Order and Disorder, and it's actually a quite persistent trope in women's writings from this time.
And are they actually sort of then subverting the Miltonic lines about she for God and him?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they're arguing. They also will cite in him, in Christ, we are all masters and servants. We are all male and female. That's another one that's very common. So in the state, I mean, people have talked about a Christian centric, right? But then in a state of grace, these social distinctions and hierarchies disappear. It actually undergirds abolitionist discourse as well. In him, we are none of us are master or servant. So that hierarchies disappear in that state. And they will also, of course, again, numerous scriptures, such as the parable of the talents. Everyone has to invest their talents. Everyone has to display their abilities. That Christ is the head. Christ is the church. He is the one to whom one must obey. So they have proto-Lockean statements saying that they are God's property and therefore have to obey him and not their husband. So they get rid of mediation.
Did these women writers get flack from others?
Oh, yeah.
I assume they had to, because that Pauline teaching was just so dominant. I mean, it's everywhere in Shakespeare.
Lady Eleanor Davies was put in prison 4 times. Anna Trapnell was accused of witchcraft and going around seducing, prostitution. She was put in prison. Elizabeth Poole was excommunicated from her church for being a whore. They paid an enormous price. Lucy Hutchinson, she's protected, I think, a bit more by her class status, but she was also, because of her husband was a satanic Christ follower. Their properties were confiscated, and they went through a lot because of that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Your point about Paul women being quiet during the Catholic Church, there's a book by Sarah Newton on Paul. And she asked, what are they doing in the church? That was illegal. To be in public places. And so she raises the question of whether the proper interpretation in terms of the culture at the time is okay, you can come to church, but don't make waves. Say we have to keep a low profile. Remember, all of Christian groups were persecuted. They needed in a formal church to make a home to keep from being discovered. And so she puts the opposite twist on this. Interpreting in terms of what Paul was thinking and saying at the time for the audience.
Yes. Well, I mean, early on, one of the earliest controversies was Anne Hutchinson in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638. She was holding private meetings in her home, where she was discussing the sermons. And she literally was put into trial and exiled into Rhode Island, where they were killed. Yeah, yeah. For what they were saying, she's not just glossing the sermons, she's rewording them, she's sermonizing. And she quoted Titus, the elder woman shall instruct the younger, and said, I'm licensed to instruct. And they said, but that's just women. I think there's men in your house too. And because men have attended these meetings, you and all of them are out. They went to prison and were exiled. So they were also using homes and even as churches, talk about this in domesticity and dissent a lot, how they literally turned, they were called tub preachers. It wasn't just men, not just women did this, but also mechanic or lower class men would take tubs and turn them upside down and stand on them as a pulpit, or bricks or boards. And so they would literally turn it into a church. And the church authorities said, that's not a church. And they said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, that's a church. And so, of course, yes, they were arrested. These were illegal. They were called conventicles because there were little groups of women involved in them. So they were very interested in those questions of space and emulating the primitive church. Right? That's what they said. We're returning to the true church, not these big baroque structures that are financed by tithes and full of people with fancy clothes.
So if I